It is a distinct pleasure of mine to introduce the next speaker, someone that I've been friends with for a number of years. We've collaborated on some things about which I think he's going to speak a little bit today. But more than that, actually going back to when I was in school, one of the things that would be brought out to look at by my professor were stacks of upper and lower case. And that publication was one of the things that taught me like what great graphic design looked like. And years later, to come to meet an editor and publisher of that was really something special. And I'm really thrilled that John Barry is going to come up on stage and talk to us about the typography of books. Come on up, John.
How's this? Yeah. I should say I was the final editor of upper and lower case. It didn't last that long. I didn't last that long. The company didn't last that long. Unlike a lot of people here, I'm not a type designer. I'm a typographer. I work with type. I design with type. I usually describe myself as an editor and typographer because I care about the words and I care about how they're presented. And this seems completely natural to me. It's not visual or verbal, it's both. So books, I consider books, the purpose of books is to be read. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I think the best talks are the ones that end up with a lot of questions and interaction at the end. So starting with, this is a page from one of W.A. Dwiggins's books, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, as you can see, but a very standard design of pages. This is also a Dwiggins designed book, rather more commercial. And this is obviously much older. Look at the text. It's solid. It's with drop caps, but otherwise very straightforward. This is actually a page spread from the Nuremberg Chronicle, actually a page from Adrian Wilson's book about the Nuremberg Chronicle. So you can see that even back 500 years ago, they were doing things that I think I would say, don't do that. Don't butt into the text block with artwork. That tells me that you care more about the art than about the text. But then look at that text block on the left. Those lines are actually quite long and not as easy to read as some. A much more modern book, one that I designed using a fairly traditional orientation of the text blocks with classical proportions. A much more compact book. I think the line length is one of the most important things for readability. Doesn't matter so much what typeface you use, it's how you treat it. It's the space that matters. And the line length is the most important thing. Letting space between lines is important, and obviously everything else. This one, I used was a book of essays, and they tried to fit in a lot of them, not starting a new page for each one. Very straightforward. The treatment of, I treated the running heads very traditionally. This had the same, a very different book, but had the same requirement. It was a small publisher, and neither the author nor the publisher cared what the pages looked like. They just wanted as many words on the page as possible. The author, Jan Tschichold, is a very high-end academic critic, and he tends to use 50-cent words. So I was afraid I was going to have to do something with very short lines to make it readable. What I discovered was he may be very intellectual, but his sentences just tumble out and run on and on. So a relatively long line with a fairly condensed typeface worked just fine for his prose, as long as I gave it enough space between the lines. And again, I ran the essays in rather than starting a new page. Just as a reality check, this is what it looks like, or a scan of what it looks like when you're actually holding the book. So can I go back? Yes. It looks so nice on your screen. The margins are exactly what you want. It's all flat. But the reality is a book is not a two-dimensional object. It's a three-dimensional object. So you have to pay attention to the gutter. Just a couple more kinds of pages, standard pages, different kinds of content, different elements that you might use. Now, those were all books that were just text. This is a book of essays with some images, most of them in the left-hand column, occasionally being set into the text column. I do not let images push into the text. That's just never. Never. Did I say never? Never. Another book I designed, you may have noticed I tend to like a main text column on the right and then a narrow column on the left, which can have images, it can have notes, it can have side heads, it can have all kinds of things. In this book, let's go back a moment. You see the main text column is fairly wide, and then this is a continuation. I think the finished book did not end up this way. This was sample pages, but I love having it come out exactly at the bottom of that image. But then the other side, the right-hand side, is a secondary kind of text, which was in smaller size and, of course, proportionally letting everything in 2 columns within the larger text column. So within that column, 2 small columns. One of my favorite book designers and typographers is Joost Hochuli, the Swiss designer who is a master of the grid, but he is not a slave to the grid. He always breaks out of the grid and uses it as a tool. That's what makes his work so great. He also has written the book Detail and Typography about all the stuff that I care about, the stuff that nobody notices. This is a book about his book design, so it's showing examples of his book design. So it's kind of a meta book. And from a book that I designed on newspaper design, I used, it's got several different levels of information. Actually, a phrase that I learned in doing the book was levels of entry to the information. So I used a narrow column reminiscent of a newspaper column, although ragged right. And I also had page spreads that were not continuous text. This is spread about a particular subject with a bit of what I call large text, big text, that is not a caption. It is an accompanying text. I actually had to decide which version of Miller to use, whether to use, because that size is technically a display size, but it's actually a paragraph of text, so I used the text cut. And you know, you can play with the layout. This was from a book I did for Microsoft on the clear type fonts. This specific one is in the section about Meirio, the Japanese typeface. And you can see one of the things being illustrated here was frequency of different kinds of characters in Japanese typesetting today. And then just to remind us we're not just talking about the English language or the Latin alphabet. This is a page spread from a book of fiction from Japan. I mean, actually American. Eileen Gunn wrote the stories. This is the Japanese edition. Vertical typesetting, as you know. I've done some multilingual work. This was a book of translations of poetry by the Vietnamese poet Ho Xuan Hung, who was a very famous poet in the late 18th, early 19th century. She got away with a lot because she was an aristocrat. And she wrote in the original Vietnamese writing system, Tru Nom, which was based on Chinese but evolved beyond it 1,000 years ago. It's very, very rarely used in Vietnam today. There are institutes to keep it alive. So I had to figure out how to compose this page with 2 languages, but two languages, 2 scripts, but 3 different elements. So the left is the Vietnamese in 2 different forms. The right is the translation. Just again, a reminder of different languages. This Armenian manuscript book, I have no idea whether the marginal notes were added or if they were there at the beginning. I'm guessing added, as often happened in manuscript books. Just a bit of contemporary Armenian type. And we've had mixed languages, mixed scripts for a very long time, from at least the Renaissance. Here they're not being mixed within the same line, but they're obviously being mixed between Greek and Latin, quite literally Latin. Same here. And then you have the occasional fish. So, some practical things. I mentioned line length is crucial. So I just did some samples like this of a bit of text with otherwise said exactly the same same point size, same typeface, same leading, different line lengths, just to see what feels right. And it's going to vary from author to author, say. I did the same thing with justifying them. I must say, always allow hyphenation. Hyphenate like crazy. The point is to have a readable, easily readable and visually a text block that doesn't draw attention to itself. And that's why hyphenation is essential. Try to avoid misleading hyphenation. But the idea that you should say, oh, I can't have 3 hyphens in a row. Well, screw that. If it's the best solution, it is. This is about a more procedural kind of text. This could have been a bulleted, it is a bulleted list, it could have been a numbered procedure or something. I think it's very important, I did a lot of technical editing, very important to both write and design something like this so that it's easy to find the high level information. That this is a very important list item. Not only because when you're reading through it, it makes it clear, but when you're referring back to it, it's easy to find that again without having to go read through a whole paragraph of explanation. You make that secondary, visually and obviously the fine print. In text, in English, in Latin, well actually not just English, but in the Latin alphabet traditionally, these are the kinds of things you want in your text typeface, except for the last line is obviously optional. This is a sample that was put together by Jack Stoffaker and Sumner Stone many years ago, just showing the evolution. The top is what you might get as a TypeScript. The middle is what happens if you just typeset it with the defaults. Full caps, big M dashes, cap height, numerals, and did have the ligatures. So at the bottom, excuse me, shows what happens if you apply some real typographic refinement to it. Use a real small cap face, spread it out a little bit, use old style figures for running text. In this case, Jack preferred the N dash with spaces on either side, which is more common in Britain than the United States. I think it's more elegant. And don't use small caps if you don't have them. Self-explanatory, I hope. The fake small caps just look like you took this big guy and shrunk him down to about that size. That's not it. And if you specify small caps, think about what the worst case may be in your book. This is one where I decided to have a drop cap and small caps for the first few phrase or first few words of the line of each chapter. And then I got to this one. Okay. You have to have italic small caps in this case because I was putting all the Spanish in italics. The typeface does have that. I did not have to just slant them. I had to do a lot of hand spacing to just make that not draw attention to itself except in the way I intended. And let's see. Oh, this is just showing a little more of the paragraph. I kept wanting to rewrite it. Obama escucha, estamos en la lucha. It's just long enough to create big spaces no matter what you do, but I couldn't run crowd back up. That got too crowded, actually. So, a much older case of the same kind of thing from a Renaissance book. I always find it disconcerting that the O of known is a cap O, but that was a standard then. It should be, to me it would be more logical, since it is in the middle of a word, to have it a small cap. And of course, if you read Latin and you read Latin and you were used to this, you would not be thrown by, say, the fourth line with all those ligatures. You would know what they're supposed to be. If we look at them, if you haven't spent a lot of time with medieval manuscripts or printed books, you may not know what they are, but it's about what you're used to. And an example of sometimes you cannot avoid something ugly. This is the least bad solution, that ton, found 10. You couldn't bring it back, it would be too tight. Running all of Fountain down would draw attention to itself because the word spaces would be gigantic. So, quite often the practice of typography in a book is finding the least bad solution. And then there's the really bad. This is a book of essays, really interesting essays by an intellectual critic and poet, friend of friends of ours. He deserves much better, but this is what his book got. And it is like a compendium of bad page layout and typography. This is a scan, so it's a little easier to see. The block of small text there is actually an image. It's not part of the typesetting, but it gets in the way of reading, which is the whole point. His words are what you want to read. This really works against it. So I actually tried a couple of quick layouts to see what could be better. Just a 2-column. You could fit a lot more text on the page, actually. Resizing the images to fit into one of the columns, or a more spacious treatment. It's the same amount of text in the main text column, and using the right-hand page to show large images, small images in double column. But to use a grid and some logic just makes it a lot more readable than this. And my big project, which finally got to conclusion last year, was going to be the 25th anniversary special edition of John Crowley's novel, Little Big. It's now the 40th anniversary edition. And it was more than 15 years in the making. A one-man small publisher, obsessed and brilliant and hard to work with. So, we've managed it, but in this case, his novel was very much loved, and I wanted to use a page that would be comfortable to read. I didn't think any of the editions of the novel before were that well done. And it also has images. They're not illustrations, they're actually art by the artist Peter Milton that go with it, but are not done for it. And there's a sort of dance between the images and the text that Ron, the publisher, created. That's his vision. So I would find ways of incorporating art the way he wanted it to be done without ever butting into the text block. And I decided to use the margins for the subheads. The typeface is Clifford, which I originally got because it won the ITC type competition back when I was editing UNLC. And Akira Kobayashi designed it. It's a beautiful, traditional text face in 3 optical sizes. Whoops, go back. The project went on long enough that I started with the PostScript fonts, and then thanks to Font Shop, got the upgraded OpenType fonts to use. One of the things I was really worried about was we'd spent years, literally, laying out these pages, and then, of course, InDesign kept changing versions. So the version I had been working with no longer worked on my current Mac, so I sort of prayed and then upgraded. Thank God, nothing changed. No line lengths changed. But I was really not looking forward to that. All right. When we start thinking about books on screen and online, you start thinking again about line length. This is just looking at if you had a page in this format, it would be crazy to have a single column of text. 2 columns works fine. You get smaller text, 3 columns. So I've done a lot of thinking, and that's what Jason was talking about how to put text on screen in ways that are readable, because we're reading books on screen, we're reading text on screen. This is one Jason showed, what was that? It was TypeCon Virtual, wasn't it? Yeah. I won't go into the details, you could do that. I'm just wanting to show that we started talking about that, and that is part of the future of book design. This is a website that Jason designed, it shows off using a lot of typographic refinements on screen, and of course it is because it's Jason, it is flexible. And if you want to check that out, this is the website. It's worth taking a look at. It doesn't have, you didn't have the user tools on this that you've done in other samples, which is a little bit like, who was talking about it earlier? Anyway, that is part of the future of book design. Oh, I haven't left as much time as I thought. So, questions?
Thanks, John. So we can take time for one or two questions.
Or dispute. You can say you got it all wrong.
Thank you for that, John. You're speaking my language. I've been teaching 20 years of type and page layout typography, so whilst I'm not a typeface designer, I'm definitely a typographer. I'm a lazy typographer. I stick with the 9 to 13 line length. You appear to suggest that you set for the language or the phrasing or how the person is expressing themselves in the text. Can you just enlighten me a little bit on that?
I try to. That isn't always possible. If it is, one time I blatantly copied page design and layout and typography from a book of North Point book of Wendell Berry's essays in a book of Sam Hamill's essays, and I discovered that Sam wrote prose that just didn't break as well at that line length. The problem, of course, is if you're doing an anthology or something where it's not one person's writing. Then you have to find something that will work for everyone. But if you have the luxury, you're dealing with one person, one writer, you can adjust it. You can find out what works for that person's writing. The whole point is, how does it read? If I've done my job right, nobody notices. It's just pages are readable, and you get the author's meaning.
I think one last question from Puya.
Thank you for a great presentation. I need to sit and just go over those with you one by one. I love, especially your own designs. So do you think as we become kind of, we've seen these typefaces, we've seen books and pages, and now we're looking at things that move around and are interactive. Do you think the print book culture visually, is that changing? Like maybe kind of the extreme layouts of like Emigre magazine or something, can they like become mainstream, or is that just like too far off the kind of humanity?
Well, of course, in what we see on screens influences what people put on paper. But I think that the design of pages, the design of paragraphs is fairly conservative. You can play with it, you can try things out, but again, the point is, in a book like what I've mostly been showing, is not to show off, but to make it communicate. Obviously, there are different kinds of books that are more like fashion magazines, and that's not the purpose. Or it's, as you were saying about nostalgique, it's to look beautiful, not necessarily to be readable. This is about being readable and beautiful, I hope.
John, thank you so much.